Okay, and now I'm going to turn it over to Rob Verchick. Rob is a law professor at Loyola University in New Orleans, and he is the president of the Center for Progressive Reform.
Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot, Katie. We have a great program, and we're just going to get started. As Katie said, I'm from New Orleans down here, and actually the idea about the climate displacement and migration is something we talk about quite a bit. So I'm really interested to hear what we have from our guests today, and we've got a super panel. Let me just introduce them really quickly. Maxine Burkett is an expert in climate change law and climate justice, and she's a law professor at the University of Hawaii, also a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And finally, she's a member scholar of CPR. Matthew Hauer is an expert on social impacts of climate change. He's a professor of sociology at Florida State, and his recent work on sea level rise and human migration has been in the news quite a bit recently, and it's been covered in outlets from the New York Times to the National Geographic to Time Magazine. Matt has worked with scholars at CPR for several years, and we're very grateful for that. He's been generous with his ideas always and his time. And let me introduce also Saket Soni, who is a national expert on post-disaster economies, also an expert in immigrant rights and in the future of work. He is a founder and director of Resilience Force. That's an organization that's doing a lot of cool stuff. You should check it out. They are a national initiative to transform America's response to natural disasters. Let me just go ahead and get started. And Maxine, I'm going to open with a question to you, if that's okay. I'm wondering, just to get us started, can you briefly explain what climate migration is? How big of a problem do we think that it might become? And how specifically does it affect communities in the United States?
Yeah, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here and have this conversation. I'll just, dive right in because we could really spend hours on this.
Yeah, sure.
On this issue. And, first of all, I think most people understand climate migration, and it's a more popular usage in the media of climate refugees, this notion that people are on the move as a result of extremes of climate change. And it's really important to understand that there are climate extremes that are introducing a new kind of trigger for migration of people. Important too to understand that migration generally is a multi-causal affair, but as climate extremes become more frequent and more intense and certainly longer in duration, the climate signal becomes more detectable and in some cases undeniable. So there's this notion that there's a new kind of climate fuel trigger for human migration. And that is, there have been attempts to kind of understand the different ways in which that happens. Scholars have oftentimes looked at sort of the 5 different scenarios that might trigger migration. It could be sudden events like Hurricane Maria or the California wildfires that introduce a kind of displacement that is sudden and is in response to an unusually extreme event. There's slow onset events like sea level rise, which you know a lot about, as you've mentioned, Rob, being down in the Gulf area. Many parts of the country are looking at that as a potential trigger for migration. The part of the country I live in here in the Pacific, the small island developing states are understood to be particularly vulnerable to the changes in climate, and it could be heat, fresh water, the kinds of things that make habitability really difficult on top of sea level rise and our understanding of especially atoll island nations that are particularly vulnerable to the changes in climate and are looking at, in some cases, the possibility of complete relocation of their communities. Planned relocation for communities in the Arctic. Again, Rob, you're sort of an epicenter of some of the conversations around that with tribal communities in the Delta region. And then there's a linkage in terms of thinking about migration and climate change that's about the resources that we rely on that make life possible in a certain space being strained in a way that introduces potentials for conflict. And that conflict itself can spur migration. So there are a number of different ways you can see climate change interacting with decision-making around migration, whether it's forced or voluntary and planned, whether it's temporary and you can go home, or permanent and that your former home is no longer viable. You asked about numbers. We have estimates that range in terms of global numbers from 25 million to I've seen 1 billion and 2 billion even. And so the numbers range from by a factor of at least 40. So we're not sure exactly what the scope of what we're talking about, but I think everyone agrees that we're talking about a large number and that most of that migration will happen within countries, within borders. And so I think in terms of the United States, the challenge will be about the size within our country, but of course, cross-border migration, even if it's a small number of people, as we've seen in other contexts, introduces its own difficulties with respect to conflicts at the border, laws about migration, refugee and asylum access issues for those who might be migrating. So there are a number of ways in which the United States engages with this issue. And we do know the numbers themselves of people that are moving will almost certainly increase.
And I think sort of implied in that too, Maxine, people move in different ways, right? I mean, it might be something that just, if it's a hurricane like the one that happened in New Orleans or elsewhere, people just move immediately and they hadn't planned on anything. Sometimes people sort of gradually trickle out of communities, and it's not until you look backwards that you see that there's been a migration that's occurred, I suppose. And then there are situations when entire communities as a whole kind of want to pick up and leave and find property somewhere else. And
that's right. And each of those scenarios
and those are all, I guess, those are all possibilities within the United States.
Those are all possibilities within the United States. If we think about the displacements that happened after Hurricane Maria, and those U.S. citizens that left Puerto Rico and were displaced to parts of the United States, that sometimes that was temporary, sometimes that was a permanent relocation. Again, communities on the ground, Pacific Northwest, Olympic Peninsula, again in Alaska, discussions about relocation are full-bodied for good reason, because it's a pretty urgent and present tense concern for communities. And it's important to note that because the scenarios are diverse, the agencies, the communities, the demographics of those communities, the appropriate laws, state, local, and national, are all implicated and require different sort of execution based on the scenarios that are involved. And again, even though the numbers might be small, some of the most difficult questions become about the international law at borders.
Thank you. Saket, are you on the line? Oh, he may still be working to join us. But Saket, if you can hear, as soon as you can get on. Oh, you are?
Yeah.
Welcome.
Yes,
it's great to have you.
Thank you. Great to be here, and thanks for facilitating this discussion, Rob.
Well, were you able to hear my question to Maxine?
Yes, I did.
Her answer? Oh, excellent.
Her excellent answer.
Yeah, well, we're going to give you a chance now. my question is that I know that you, like all of us here, have been studying this quite a bit, although we see it from different perspectives depending upon our work. You are working as an advocate, as an activist, a community organizer. And what I'm wondering is your group, Resilience Force, it helps communities respond more effectively to disasters in general, although many of those disasters will have some kind of association with climate breakdown, I'm assuming. What are the populations that you work with in your day-to-day work? And can you describe sort of the types of groups or the types of individuals that you work with whose lives have been disrupted by climate breakdown?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can helpfully just build on Maxine's
certainly.
points. You know, I'm a labor and community organizer, and I started my work after Katrina in New Orleans, where you are, and watched how post-Katrina some could return and some couldn't, and looked for the reasons for that. And Katrina is an important part of the story still. It was a single climate disaster that forced 400,000 people out of the New Orleans metro area. And just to put that in perspective, 6 million people left the South by some estimates over 30 years during the Great Migration. Mm-hmm. So nearly 500,000 because of a single event was extraordinary. And one of the things I learned from just being in that post-Katrina environment was, the sort of question of what makes someone a migrant is about as simple or complex as just the question of what is home. I mean, home is the ability to stick to a place because of a job, but it's also belonging. It's also a sense of place. One person I represented wound up in Houston a year later and decided he wanted to come back home where he belonged to the Calliope public housing development. Mm-hmm. And he made his way back. The housing development had been destroyed, and over the next 2 years, he was caught in the sort of national debate and struggle over what to do with public housing. He and other working class people tried to occupy public housing, protest for public housing. Eventually, that public housing development gave way, to a very flawed process of mixed-use housing that replaced it. And very few of the people he knew then, before the storm, before the levee breach in New Orleans, were able to return. So, there's, I think that where climate disasters are concerned, at least, we can really often pinpoint the moment in which people decide to leave. What's more interesting and important is the period of time during which people decide to come back. What allows them to come back? What government intervention or social supports help or hinder their coming back? And how race, class, and gender play a role in whether they can come back. As we all know, housing is both an indicator of and a contributor to wealth, and particularly racial wealth in this country. And so the meaning of housing and your housing status, and indeed in some parts of the country, the way that caste really is made up of housing and job and social status, has a lot to do with whether you can come back. So more recently, during Hurricane Irma, it was estimated that 6.8 million Floridians, nearly a third of the state's population, were forced to leave their homes. A lot of people drove north. 200,000 of them, it said, took refuge in about 700 shelters across the state. 27,000 households were made uninhabitable by the storm. And whether those households were able to rebuild, has a lot to do with whether they were privately insured, whether HUD money kicked in if they were not privately insured, and what kind of relief, FEMA calculated they had. So just a quick story. A telling example was a couple I met after Hurricane Michael. They were, their names are Shane and Liz. They have 3 young boys. They were living in Panama City. And before Hurricane Michael hit, which was in 2018, Shane was a construction worker at a towing company. Liz was working part-time as a server in a restaurant in Panama City Beach. They were part of the tourism and construction economy where they lived. And they returned home from evacuation to find their rental mobile home damaged. The landlord evicted them. Shane's company went out of business. They had $1,800 saved before the storm. They sent their kids away, but they tried to stay, and they went to the day labor corner. And they tried to get jobs, but they were kicked off the corner. There wasn't security. The Florida social safety net meant for people like them, comprising of disaster SNAP and disaster unemployment, were completely unfunded and collapsed. And they found themselves living in a tent city outside of a Walmart in their own hometown looking for work. They were strangers in their own home. Now, you know, if you saw a picture of them before the storm, you would not have said that this is a couple that is going to become America's emblematic climate refugee. You know, they are white, young renters in the north of Florida. And yet, to this day, they're sleeping on park benches and eating at times out of, you know, eating food cooked out of a van, you know, where the slow cooker is connected to the car battery. So that's a lot of what we see.
Let me ask you a quick question, Saket, if it's okay. You say that we might see these folks or meet them and not think of them as climate refugees. I wonder, do you think they see themselves as climate refugees? Is that part of their identity in the way that they see themselves? Because I'm wondering to what degree climate is associated with these issues in the kind of in the American psyche.
Well, they said to us, it's like we went through the hurricane twice. You know, they were referring to their displacement, but then their sense of loss when they came back, their inability to come home. You know, I think that it's a spectrum. You know, these are individuals and people like them where you know, Hurricane Michael hit 6 largely conservative counties where 7 out of 10 voters, you know, voted with the Republican presidential candidate in the last many elections. I don't know that Liz and Shane and other people like them would necessarily, if surveyed, say that, you know, carbon emissions cause climate change, you know. But this is the difference between the climate conversation and the resiliency conversation. That large numbers of people across political bands and stripes and tribes agree that heat is causing disasters to become more destructive, and would agree with Maxine and you on sea level rise. You know, the shrimpers in Louisiana and Maryland get it. So does everybody associated with the tourist economy. So they would agree that that the world is getting warmer, and that had a lot to do with why they had to leave home.
No, that's really, I asked because I noticed the same thing in Louisiana, obviously. I mean, you can't find anyone in Louisiana who's not in favor of resilience. But then we have this debate about why we need the resilience and sort of what to do about it. I want to bring Matt in quickly. Matt, I sort of see your work as a way of drawing the camera backwards and looking at larger national patterns, sometimes international patterns. And I'm wondering, in your work in geography, when you are looking at demographic patterns, geographic patterns across the United States, are there certain patterns that you're seeing that you think we as a nation aren't paying close enough attention to?
Yeah, there's a number of different patterns, especially when it comes to migration. You know, I kind of want to echo what Maxine had said earlier about migration being multifaceted. People have a tendency to move for a lot of different reasons, and it's never just one. It's generally never just one reason, but it's sort of a basket case of reasons as to why people move.
And what are those? We know they're economic, I suppose, and demographic.
Yeah, economic, demographic, environmental, social, and political are the primary reasons. Sort of like broad brush kind of reasons, right? There's sub reasons within those different categories. And so when you kind of aggregate all those up, we know that people tend to move short distance. Well, first, people don't want to move. They call this the immobility paradox. So most people don't want to move. So you have people who are, as Saket was just talking about, a very tragic family who are staying in their home community when they could have also moved. Most people just don't want to move. So that's the first thing that pops up, and that's the same everywhere in the United States, and in a lot of cases globally. But when people do move, they tend to move short distance. So like I went into Panama City. I'm not very far away from it, just 2 hours in Tallahassee from where the hurricane hit. And we met a family who was going to Tallahassee. She was a nurse, and the nearest hospital she could find a job in was in Tallahassee. So very short distance relocation. So most people tend to move short distances. And then most people tend to try and follow their social networks. Where are their friends and their family located that they already have a network that can help them in the move, whether that's finding housing or jobs or integration into a community or just sort of local on the ground knowledge. And the final reason that people tend to move or where they make that decision has to do with enhanced social capital. So they're moving for reasons within all of this for jobs. So the simple example that I just used, similar to Hurricane Michael, the family moved short distance. They had relatives outside of Tallahassee, and she could find a job. It wasn't any one of those reasons as to why she chose to relocate their family from Panama City to Tallahassee. It's the combination of all of them. And so when you pull it way back then, and what it means for the U.S. or for internationally is that a wildfire in California is unlikely to spur migration to Tennessee or to Georgia or to New York. Or extreme heat or drought might have an effect in Arizona, where migration ends up in California or Oregon, as opposed to Boston, for instance. So the migration patterns on a U.S. scale become a bit easier to handle when you understand it tends to be social networks, economic, and short distance, the way it's driven.
So I'm wondering, what does that mean in terms of trying to shape policy, Matthew? I mean, if we know, for instance, that people are going to choose the option of moving as the last resort, or they're likely to do that, that they're going to move close to where they are moving from. So if we know that maybe people from Los Angeles might end up going to Las Vegas or Phoenix, or that people in Miami might end up going to Orlando. So having that information and knowing that people are going to put off doing it until they absolutely can't avoid it, what are the kinds of things that we might take from that in terms of fashioning policy, or in terms of fashioning some kind of an approach to enable this in a planned, managed, humane way?
Yeah, so part of that is positioning destination communities in the best possible manner. And so that involves developing social networks in where you'd imagine migration to originate from. It also means, so some of that can be related to like advertising. Some of it could be going into some of these communities and doing outreach, or just general awareness. And some of it can also be positioning the community to be a good receiving community, which means that when somebody does relocate, they can have enhanced social capital. And so some of that, is around just quality of life in a destination community, and some of it can be economic as well. And so there's a lot of things that destination places can actually do to make them more attractive or enhance their attractiveness as a destination, even if they're sort of more on the fringes. And in other places that are nearby, they're the ones that are likely to receive the majority of migrants. So especially when it comes to sort of mid or large sized cities, places like Atlanta or Dallas, or Charlotte, or Las Vegas, or places like that. They can do things to know in advance that things like affordable housing to help integration, just general quality of life to be enhanced in those communities.
I guess one of the problems is that a lot of those cities that we've mentioned are already growing really, really fast, and are already they're having problems building enough schools, enough affordable housing. I mean, Las Vegas is certainly that way, or Orlando, I think, is certainly that way. Do these communities know what's going to hit them?
Some of them do, yeah. Some of them don't. And some of it might be a little bit of willful ignorance, putting on the blinders so that way it's easy to ignore. In other cases, it's straight up ignorance, not thinking and putting these two together. Almost every city has a long range, or even state has long range planning efforts, long range strategic planning. And it's only within the last few years have I really started to see a concerted effort to incorporate climate migration into the long range plans for cities, counties, and state governments.
But you're seeing that in some places, you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's starting to happen. If I wouldn't have said the same thing about 4 years ago, it would have been much more isolated, but it seems to be becoming much more widespread.
Maxine, I want to bring you in. You've heard Saket and Matt talk mainly about issues in the lower 48, although we've mentioned Alaska a little bit. What about what you're hearing resonates with the Hawaiian Islands? Is it a similar situation, or do you have other issues on top of the ones that we've talked about already?
Well, no, I think all of this is relevant. It may take on a different hue in different places, but there are a lot of similar themes that we're hearing. I mean, Saket's mention of that sort of first and second disaster that happens, going through a storm multiple times, or going through the sort of the triggers, the traumas of that relocation multiple times, is a reflection of the fact that the initial disaster itself is one thing, and then the systemic responses or preparedness of our infrastructure, social, legal, and otherwise, is really critically important. In Hawaii, we have a unique situation, and really to sort of riff on what Matt was saying about receiving communities, we have we've had a sort of preview of what it might mean to be a receiving community and do that meaningfully. And I'm speaking specifically about Pacific Island migration to Hawaii, and how that's shaped some of our the changing demographic in the state. But again, even if the numbers are small, there have been really interesting social dynamics that have been the result of that. The migration from Micronesia, for example, has been primarily about the relationship between the US federal government and those nation states. And it's really tied up in other fraught history around nuclear testing and other pre-existing sort of legacies. And that's, I think, an important point, just to kind of quick sidebar, which is to say that there's no sort of virgin community or state that hasn't had some kind of political or other development kinds of impacts that will influence where they are in terms of preparedness and readiness and some of the more difficult questions. But for our circumstances, we have a number of Micronesian citizens who are also here lawfully, a part of our workforce, paying taxes, disproportionate representation in the military. And we have looked at that community in terms of the impacts of climate change and whether or not there is a fingerprint. But even if we, that signal, that fingerprint may be a bit fainter at the moment, we can tell a little bit about whether or not, as a receiving community, Hawaii has some work to do. The issues of discrimination, the disproportionate representation in some of the services, we have really struggled with creating the kinds of the cultural ties and bridging that would allow for a more seamless integration into the community, and one that is enhancing social capital, as is the desire for those that are migrating. We've also had, and we have an interesting opportunity because the Micronesian population is here in Hawaii, but it's also in the Pacific Northwest, it's also in Arkansas, and places that aren't proximate, but have these ties to economic opportunity that have provided interesting examples for us to look at the diversity of receiving communities and see what works, what do those that are moving need in order for that transition to be more smooth, in order for their children to be healthy and well educated, and again, culturally connected in meaningful ways. And so Hawaii's had a kind of the beginnings of looking at that. And that's been, I think, an important lesson for us, and one for other communities as we think about who might be moving where over time and how that might increase. One other bit of our sort of experience of climate migration that might be interesting to add to the mix is the sort of surprises, right? In addition to what our experience can offer about how long the sort of those migration corridors can be, right? If you think about the Marshall Islands and Arkansas, right? Those are distances that are great, but they're things that are pulling communities in that direction. We also have surprises, things that you might not expect. A lot of the climate, the migrant caravan discussion that had happened had spurred, I think, some interesting media on why people are moving, what the climate fingerprint looks like. And they looked a lot at agriculture and specifically coffee in places like Honduras. And the conversation here in Hawaii was actually about the increase in our Honduran community on Hawaii Island in the state. And no one would necessarily think of Hawaii as a place for relocation for Hondurans, but there is this is the only place you grow coffee in the United States. This is an industry that has labor needs. And we have a Honduran community and all of the attendant receiving community obligations that come with that. And so there are things that we may not anticipate, but we can actually, using some of the work that Matt has discussed and some of the stories and interventions that Saket has described, to actually figure out how we can best prepare to the extent that we can.
I want to ask you a question about international law and policy, in part because I know that you write about this often, and you've also mentioned immigration from Micronesia and other countries. As you know, and as you've written about, refugee law in international law is not a very good fit for the climate crisis, in part because it's mainly concerned about political oppression as opposed to economic or some kind of environmental degradation. And so a lot of people have sort of thrown up their hands and sort of wondered what it was that international law could provide, or did we have to invent something else? And just about 10 days ago, the United Nations Committee on Human Rights came out with a ruling that involved a migrant from Kiribati, an island nation in the South Pacific. And what it came down to, it found the committee found as a matter of international law that if somebody was fleeing a country or had flown a country, and that they could find that there was an immediate threat because of climate change in their home community, that they could not, as a matter of international law, be forced to return back to that place. Of course, the migrant in this particular case lost because he was not, according to the committee, able to make that showing of an immediate threat. What I'm wondering, it's funny, I tweeted about this when I first read it, and I said, oh, this is a big deal. And then I got people tweeting back to me saying, oh, it's really not such a big deal. And then I got in a conversation with some of my colleagues who are actually making me rethink this. So I guess I'm just going to ask you, I mean, do you think that this holding that at least under certain circumstances, it would be against international law to send a migrant back fleeing an immediate threat from his country on account of climate change? Is that a big deal, or is it something that is rarely in practice going to come up, you think?
No, that's a great question, and I think I think the strength and beauty and the relevance of international law is in the eye of the beholder. So it being a big deal is a big deal, right? In some respects, and it has generated a conversation that's really important. I will say that there are other ways in which you might there are international obligations. I mean, we have some things like the temporary protected status in the United States, for example, that recognizes that people who are in the country and there's disasters and other reasons why they can't be returned, they can stay. There are ways in which we relate to other citizens in times of crisis that matter. This particular ruling is, committee finding is that it would be a violation of human rights, right? The right to life. It may, touch on on other inhumane treatment if you send people back, and that is a really critical, I think, statement of the connection between human rights and climate change impacts, and it is, I think, important in that way. It is a big deal in that it is attaching that to our recognized human rights. And some of the most the ones that we would order as the most important in terms of, the right to life and dignity and those things. So I think it is an important decision. What that may mean in terms of, say, the US doing something different is unclear. And I think that's where you have the sort of fault lines between those who think it's a big deal and those who think it's not. It is a big deal to have an international body say that could be a violation of human rights. And there are reputational costs to it. There's a way of framing and thinking about it that's really critical for how we discuss it as human beings relating to other human beings. What it means in terms of practically bringing, a country to account for not providing refuge based on their inaction. That's much more difficult. So in terms of it in practice, again, in execution, it will vary. But I do think it's really important for each of these statements to be made and for it to be explicitly stated that climate change is, and what it does to people's ability to have, to thrive and to have a livelihood that is meaningful, is that climate change is a direct threat to that, and increasingly so.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. Saket, I want to bring you in. On the conversation, you had talked earlier about the personal experiences that people who have been displaced by storms or other results of climate disruption, the things that they endure and the challenges they have. And I'm wondering what sorts of law or policy related to human rights or to anti-discrimination law or to these other kinds of policies we can associate with human dignity and need. How do you use those ideas or laws as an advocate to champion the positions of the people that you're working with?
Well, there's sort of two sets of people that we work with, and they often overlap. There are people who lose their homes and lose their place and become displaced, residents of a place who are pushed out as a result of climate disaster or climate change. They become internally displaced along some spectrum. And, then there's a second group of migrants who often include those displaced. But when a disaster hits, it creates a new economy, which is this rising resilience economy. As a result of disaster, you get the biggest construction sites in the world and all of the industries around it. And thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of workers come to rebuild. And so on one hand, you have a group of people displaced, and on the other hand, you have a group of people coming in. After Katrina, the people displaced were largely African-American. The people coming in were largely undocumented immigrants. And in that situation, African-Americans were largely locked out of the jobs in the reconstruction. Mm-hmm. And immigrant workers were largely locked in to exploitative circumstances. And so in both of those experiences, whether you're locked out or locked in, race is a major factor. Your personal wealth and connections tie in. Nationality and certainly immigration status tie in. So, whether you're displaced out or brought in, amid climate change, the sources of your vulnerability or power are still the sources of your vulnerability and power, and they continue to be, compounded. So, for example, we represent large numbers of immigrant workers who find themselves in situations of everything from wage theft to forced labor in the rebuilding economy after climate disasters. I would say, though, that this is an area where new law has to follow imagination. We have to, as a nation and as communities, start to imagine the things we need as we start to hold more and more displaced people. We will need a vastly expanded set of social supports, including a much fuller safety net and a much broader set of rights for immigrants coming in, for non-US migrants, whether they're arriving to work or whether they're arriving because they themselves are displaced from another country like Honduras because of climate change. We need new status. The current set of protections and status for them aren't enough. And so at a fundamental level, for the first few years here, I think we all need to focus on just a recognition through the law of displacement as a result of migration, and a recognition through the law of the work, the labor that the climate crisis is producing, and a recognition of people who do that labor. The current legal protections at the state level and the set of tools we have at the federal level are nowhere near enough. So most places fall well beneath, in their own state-supported social safety net, fall well beneath the actual amount that people need. Disaster SNAP doesn't go far enough in feeding people who are displaced. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, if you think about all of those people who were in Houston after Katrina or are across the mainland after Maria, that 1 year is the year in which people decide usually to either stay in their own, stay outside or return to their old place. There's so much that needs to be done in that year that requires government intervention, and it's not being done. So asserting, for example, that communities that were renters or communities in low-income housing or middle-income housing have the human right to have their housing be brought up to code, back up to code within a year, so that they can return there, so that their provinces are inhabitable. In our culture and our politics, that kind of housing is thought of as a commodity that's good for those who can afford it and a problem for the insurance companies, not as a human right, and not that these are people to be made whole by their federal government. So I think that's some of what needs to change.
No, it's an interesting point you make. That one of the determinants, once somebody has left, they may come back, but part of that is going to have to do with what's going on in the community that they left, what the recovery is like.
That's right, and what's available.
In Puerto Rico, we saw that obviously in New Orleans years back. I want to make sure that we have a chance for those the audience members to ask questions. So I'm going to turn this back to you, Katie. I know you've been collecting some questions.
Yes, thank you. And we're going to now open it for questions. I'll read them and try to direct them to each of our panelists the best I can. If you have other questions, please go ahead and type those into the Q&A box, which should be located at the bottom of your screen. We'll try and get to as many as we can and then answer any afterward that we don't get to now. So the first question is, I believe, directed for Saket. Do you see workers' unions as a force for the integration of documented and undocumented immigrants into the United States and overcoming nationalist sentiment? Have neoliberal policies or inequality exacerbated this sentiment in workers' unions as they have in broader society?
Yes, to both of those, absolutely. I mean, just to connect this to climate, as disasters have become more frequent and more destructive, and as the number of billion-dollar disasters have grown, just to name one industry, the need to rebuild communities has grown. And not to just rebuild back to how we were, but if we're going to be stronger and are going to be able to weather the next storm and the next one after that, or the next flood or fire, then homes and communities need to become resilient, more able to endure for the long term. That will require a vast new workforce, a workforce that in the last 10 years has been emerging. And that's just one example of a workforce that worker centers and unions should tap into, should access, should include. That, however, will take whole new forms of organizing. Some of what we're trying to do and motivate. On the question of neoliberalism, I think that there is a really unfortunate narrative in the United States about unions in decline. When in fact, what has happened is unions have been so under attack. And then in the last chapter of the book, when they're down and struggling, then very ahistorically, we term them as having declined, as if it's a matter of their own vibrancy. The truth is that unions are among the best vehicles for creating an integrated working class. We see that. And not just the traditional unions, but the newer kinds of worker organizations that are unions in spirit. Every month in Panama City, we have 100 or more workers come together to talk about what they want from each other, what they want from the construction industry, but also to talk about climate change and their experiences of race and immigration. And so worker organization absolutely, can play that role. Absolutely.
Great, thank you, Saket. So the next question is for Matthew and Maxine, and you guys can take it in whichever order you like. But there's an interesting conversation right now about what municipalities can do in theory to plan for climate migration. Are there any examples of municipalities starting to prepare? I'll
hit this up right off the bat. Yes. So I've started doing work with Ann Arbor, Michigan, as just a concrete example about trying to position Ann Arbor to be better positioned for climate migrants. The city was starting to really think about how Ann Arbor could be better positioned to be a receiving community. I was asked about some work in Chicago as well, for so small size city, Ann Arbor, much larger size city in Chicago, around climate migration as well, and how the city could prepare as well. So I'm seeing it much more frequently than I had in the last 5 years or so, where cities and municipalities are really beginning to think long range about it. Some of them seem to be chomping at the bit, if you will, to try and really position themselves well, and others seem to be a bit more apprehensive about it. Those tend to be more in the middle, where they might be experiencing or expected to experience more adverse climate impacts.
I'll just say that, yeah, what Matt's described is sort of spot on. There have been some really interesting and research about sort of places to go, right? Some of the maybe climate destinations that Jesse Michael Keenan has done. That's been sort of at least an interesting inquiry into what it might look like to have destination communities that are actually advertising on their ability to sort of weather the long-term climate forecast. We'll see what happens there. But I will say in places like Hawaii, where there is, at the very least, a very open opportunity to talk about climate change in ways that aren't sort of necessarily fear-driven, that you have the opportunity for more forward-looking and progressive policy as compared to conversations where discussion about migration really triggers concern about the changing face of a community and other kind of xenophobic possibilities. So I think having the conversation and framing it in appropriate ways is going to be really important wherever you are.
Great, thank you. So the next question is, says the dialogue takes a new direction if you bring in the issue of agriculture and farm workers. Farm workers are also being affected by how climate change is affecting crops, pests on crops, crop migration, and natural disasters affecting crops, and hence farm workers' jobs. In addition, farm workers in the US are increasingly climate migrants coming from other countries that are being impacted by climate change. Could you speak to this? I think it might be directed at Saket, but whoever would like to take this.
Well, it's absolutely true that workers and particular types of workers are often the first witnesses of and first processors of climate change and how it's changing ways of life. Workers connected to coastal work, farm work, roofers changing houses. So things, work that involves being outside and work that involves crop and livestock. These workers are actually experts, untapped experts on climate change because they experience it cycle by cycle. In our membership, we have a large number of people who in their past lives were rural agricultural workers who left. And they made the decision to leave over time as a result of an intricately woven set of circumstances, a totality of circumstances. Not that one day there's crop failure because of heat and they leave, but so many other things contributing to it. But undeniably, climate change is part of their experience. So yes, I think that the question is really a good one. There's a need to kind of tap into the moral authority of farm workers and really connect that to climate. And also, so many people depend on farm workers. And so it would be interesting to tap into that more. You're absolutely right. We're certainly seeing this play out a great deal in Florida and other places where we work. Farm workers also live in housing that is incredibly vulnerable to disasters and is most often uninsured. So they also become disproportionately displaced after floods and fires.
Maxine or Matt, did you want to add to that? Okay, I'll move to the next one. So the next one is from Judy Robinson with Coming Clean. She mentions petrochemical operations, including mining, oil, refining, pipelines, and so on, are often located in areas impacted by extreme weather resulting from climate change, and also predominantly occupied by residents of color and low income who lack resources to protect from acute and chronic hazards. Have you engaged with community residents and workers who might be migrating either by force or by choice because of these hazards and incidents? And do you think planning is required to prepare for what may occur?
I can say something about this being in Louisiana. I'm struck by the multiplicity of threats, right, that many communities face. And one of the things, living in New Orleans, right by the chemical corridor, Cancer Alley, as they call it, is there's there's a generation's worth of movement now where there are whole communities that actually have been forced to leave because of heavy air pollution or accidents at refineries and things like that in that area. And when they have left, they don't relocate as an entire community, and the social capital is all diminished, and people are kind of scattered to the winds, and jobs are lost and communities are lost. And if you talk to these folks, they say they see each other at funerals and weddings, and that's about it, right? And what's interesting about that is is it's not a climate change story necessarily, but it influences how other communities in southern Louisiana are now thinking about climate relocation. Because many of the groups in southern Louisiana who might have to move are also are also socially vulnerable populations, whether it's people of color or people who are poor or who don't have a lot of opportunities in education, whatever it is. And they're starting to say, oh my gosh, I don't want to suffer the same kind of migration woes that people suffered because of Cancer Alley. And often, you know, that's African American communities in Louisiana who are saying, geez, look what you did. You know, you made Cancer Alley a sacrifice zone. Now you're making southern Louisiana wetlands a sacrifice zone. You know, you're going to protect New York City, but you're not going to protect southern Louisiana wetlands. And I think that just raises a really hard question, because there are going to be communities that leave, and the oil industry has been very clear. I mean, they're here because the oil's here, but when they have a chance at deciding where they're going to put more refining capacity or other kinds of capacity, they're looking for areas that are not in hurricane paths. And they were very clear about that after Hurricane Katrina. And so we are going to see job loss as a result of that. And people who aren't going to be able to follow those jobs are going to be stuck with the dwindling economy.
Thank you. I have one last question before we hit 3 o'clock, and I'll direct this one to Maxine. With the new UN decision coming down about the potential of the climate crisis affecting right to life, do you think the definition of refugee in the 1951 Convention is outdated and should be expanded or revised to include individuals affected by environmental or economic harms? Or would that weaken the strength of the current definition and its ability to help refugees as defined by persecution?
That's quite a last question. I'll do what I can in a minute. I mean, this is the million-dollar question, really. I mean, one of the things that we understand about the limits of the Refugee Convention is that the definition is describing a phenomenon that is not always limited to the circumstances described in the definition itself, right? So the necessity for persecution, for urgency. A big one is the fact that you can't look to your own government for help in that, in sort of being put in a better position. A lot of those things aren't coming together within the climate change context. And there has been oodles and oodles of conversation about whether or not it requires a new convention or whether or not we revise and amend that convention. I think most people think that the amendment of the convention of the current convention will open up the Pandora's box and potentially undermine the good things that the Refugee Convention does now. And for a new convention specific to climate change refugees, if you set aside some of the difficulties around specific definitions, understanding the triggers and the parameters for when you become a climate change refugee, just those sort of antecedent questions make it really difficult to imagine a treaty that would be satisfying for everybody. And in both scenarios, getting an actionable convention agreed upon and signed and ratified by enough parties to be meaningful would take probably longer than we have. And so the question, I think, becomes, are there, what are we seeking? And what we're seeking is some kind of coordinated effort, so an acknowledgement of the issues that are raised by the movement of people, the justice concerns that are at the base of it, and finding a way for their rights to be honored meaningfully. And I it's sort of a broken record kind of thing to do, but for all of these issues, the first question is, what are we doing to stop this from happening, right? And how are we going to then understand who are the frontline communities and what are the ways in which they track prior disadvantages and injustices and economic opportunities that have been thwarted in some ways, and think about this in a more holistic fashion. There are specific steps to get there, but my suggestion is that, and where I tend to fall on this, is that the Refugee Convention is more a symptom of what we're seeking than necessarily the cure for the ill itself. So I hope that helps.
Thank you. And so we've approached 3 o'clock. So I just wanted to, before we end, thank all of you, our presenters, and Rob for moderating, and everyone who participated in the webinar today. We really appreciate you being here and taking the time out of your day to join us for this conversation. As we close, I just wanted to mention a few other things, which is that when you end the webinar, you will receive a survey. We ask you that you please fill that out so that we can improve our webinars and get some ideas and priorities for what we should focus on in the future. And then on the slide, you'll also see a few additional resources with some links. We'll also email these around afterward. And then remember that the webinar will be was recorded, and that recording will be sent around soon. So thank you all again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.